So the first time most people open the Fairlight page in Resolve, they look at it for about 3 seconds and immediately they click back to the edit page. I've watched it happen in my classroom more times than I probably can count. And I understand why. Because the moment you land on that page, it stops looking like a video editing tool. It looks like a recording studio. And if nobody's actually walked you through what you're freaking looking at, it's genuinely intimidating. But here's what I want you to actually hold on to. Fairlight is not as complicated as it looks. Yes, it looks hard, but it's not actually that hard. Not once you know what you're actually looking at. So that's what this video is. I'm going to walk you through the Fairlight workspace, what the different sections are, what they do, and why they're actually there. And by the time we're done, you'll have a real mental map of this page. No mixing yet, no EQ, no compression, just orientation. You can't work confidently in a room you've never been in. So I should be straight with you about my background before we actually get into this. I trained on Pro Tools. That's the DAW or the DAW I came up on professionally. And if you've ever opened Pro Tools, you know it's a serious piece of software. Full-featured, also genuinely maybe a little bit expensive, and if I'm being honest, pretty intimidating the first time you open it up as well. The reason I want to teach Fairlight instead of Pro Tools, it's not that Fairlight is a lesser tool, it's that you're probably already editing in Resolve, which means Fairlight's already there, you already essentially have it, you've already paid for it if you have the studio version, but it's also free in the free version. And in my experience, the biggest barrier to better audio in student work and beginner work, it isn't skill, it's friction. When the audio tool feels separate, unfamiliar, or maybe out of reach, people skip the audio work. They slap on some music, they call it done, and their project actually suffers for it. And audio is really going to break a project faster than almost anything else will. I had a student this past academic year who asked me why I actually wasn't teaching Fairlight in the first year of the program. She wasn't a fan of Adobe Audition. That's the software we use in the first year of our program. And she'd already started digging around in DaVinci Resolve on her own after I actually introduced the first year class to Resolve as a video editor. That question really stuck with me because she had a point. If you're already editing in Resolve, it actually makes sense to mix there too. And that's what this series is. It's the thing I'm building so that you and my students don't bounce off that page. You land on it, you recognize it, and you just freaking get to work. All right, so I've got Resolve open and I'm on the Fairlight page. If you want to follow along, you can open a project that you've already been working on in the edit page. It should be one with at least, a couple of audio tracks in it. And then you can click this little music icon. It says Fairlight underneath on my screen to move over to the Fairlight page. It's now the 7th icon over to the right if you're in DaVinci Resolve 21 like I am now. Go ahead and take a second to just look around and look at what's in front of you. And we're going to go through this section by section. So let's talk about what Fairlight actually is. Before we look at anything on screen, I want to kind of establish something foundational here because, I think understanding this one thing, it's going to make the whole interface feel a little bit less foreign to you. So Fairlight is a DAW, sometimes also called a DAW. That's a digital audio workstation. It's the same category as Pro Tools, as Logic Pro or Adobe Audition. All of those tools can do the same basic job. They can record, they can edit, they can mix audio. They look a little bit different from one another and they use slightly different terminology at times perhaps, but the underlying logic and the way that they work is the same across all of those pieces of software. So when you open the Fairlight page and you feel overwhelmed, what you're mostly reacting to is an unfamiliar layout. It's not unfamiliar logic, it's an unfamiliar layout. And the concepts you're going to learn here exist in every DAW. Faders, EQ, panning, a mixer, output meters. None of this is actually unique to Fairlight. Once you know what the sections are called and essentially what they do, this page is going to start to look a lot like every other audio environment you've actually worked in before. And that's really the shift that I want you to start making from, I have no idea what I'm looking at to I know what this category of tool is and what it's supposed to do. Okay, now the four main areas on this Fairlight page. I'm going to point at each one and give you a quick read on what it does. Don't worry about memorizing any of this yet. You're just kind of building a mental map and kind of an understanding of the user interface. So the first one is the timeline. This is the large section that takes up most of the screen. So that's this guy right here. It's essentially, it looks like your editing timeline, but you're not seeing a video track. Even though the video is here, you're just looking at your audio tracks. Your video is actually on the top right here. Clips sit on each of these tracks. The tracks run horizontally, from left to right. So they're moving from left to right, the same as the edit page would. And, time moves forward from left to right. It's the same idea. The difference here is that the timeline is essentially built for audio work. If I zoom in just a little bit here, you're starting to see waveforms there. The zooming and navigation tools are maybe a little bit more precise. The editing tools are optimized for, fine audio work that you can't really do comfortably on the edit page. Trimming clips to the exact right frame, moving things by tiny amounts, drawing volume automation, that's all going to be done in this page. This is where you'll spend most of your time. The next one is the mixer, and I'm actually just going to move over to the right here and just click and drag and open this up a little bit. Just so you can see I think we've got about 9 tracks. I'm just going to bring it back here just to make sure it doesn't interfere or I don't block it with my picture-in-picture there. And it's over on the right-hand side of the screen. You're seeing columns of vertical scripts, one for each track in your timeline. That's the mixer. And if you've never worked with a mixing console before, I think here's a good way to think about it. Each strip in the mixer is a control panel for one track. That tall kind of vertical slider on the bottom there, this guy right here, that's the fader that controls the volume of that track. Above that, there are a variety of different things, panning, EQ, dynamics processing, all of that good stuff. There may be 1 or 2 things that you are not seeing, maybe like voice isolation and dialogue leveler. Those may be only studio features, but this, for the most part, should look more or less the same in the free version that you're looking at. We're going to spend entire videos on each of these things, but for right now, just understand the relationship. Every track in your timeline has a strip on the mixer. So A1 is this track here, etc. And, the mixer is where you shape how each track sounds and how it sits relative to everything else. Okay, the next section of the interface that I want to talk about is the meters. And you can see them on the top here. So there's a whole lot of kind of corresponding meters for the different tracks here. And then you have bus 1's meter, and then you've got kind of control room loudness, etc. So meters are the way that you can kind of monitor your output and monitor your levels. They are going to matter a lot in this series. We'll talk later about hitting specific level targets for delivery, where your peak should land, what's too loud, what's too quiet. And the meters are essentially how you know whether you've hit those targets. You think of them a little bit like a speedometer. You want them visible while you work. It's probably a good idea for you to go ahead and hit play on your timeline right now. If you've got one loaded, watch those meters move. And that's essentially your mix speaking to you. Okay, and then the last section I want to talk about is the index. On the far left here, you're going to see the track index, and it's a list of all your tracks, names, and maybe a few quick controls, mute and solo buttons. If your project has a lot of tracks and the timeline's getting quite dense, the index is kind of a faster way to navigate than scrolling around trying to find a specific track. So you can kind of scroll through there and find the relevant track. You can mute the track from there, you can solo it to hear it in isolation, or you can just use the index to get kind of a quick overview of how your session is organized. So that's essentially how things are more or less laid out. You'll also see at the top here, there are buttons to turn on and off various sections of the interface. So I can turn the index on and off by just clicking that button. I can actually bring up the media pool if I want to find maybe some audio that I need to put in on the timeline. The media pool is the same as it is in the media page or in the edit page. You can open up effects where you can kind of find different effects if you want to apply them at the clip level instead of the track level. Groups is if you're kind of grouping tracks into various groups. Then there's a sound library that you can open and a button for ADR, which is automated dialogue replacement. And then over on the right, you can turn the mixer on and off. You can turn the meters on and off. You can check metadata on various clips. And then you can open up the inspector as well. Okay, so next I want to talk about mono versus stereo tracks. And, this is the one that really trips up beginners, I feel, more than anything else in Fairlight. So I want to spend a little bit of time on it before we actually move on. When your tracks come into Fairlight from the edit page or when you create new tracks, they're going to be either mono or stereo. And that actually matters because they behave a little bit differently. So mono means that there's one channel of audio, there's one signal. And when a mono track plays back, it comes out of both left and right speakers, but it's still fundamentally one stream of information. Your dialogue is, I would say, almost always mono. A lavalier mic, a shotgun mic, a handheld recorder recording a single channel, all of that's mono. And a mono track sits in the center of your stereo field by default. Then stereo means two channels, a left signal and a right signal. Music tracks are almost always stereo. You might get stereo room tone and ambience as well. Sometimes it can be mono. A stereo track already has width in it. There's left and right information. Those are distinct from one another. And the practical rule, generally dialogue tracks should be mono. Music tracks should be stereo. Ambience tracks, usually stereo, but sometimes mono as well. In this project, I actually have mono ambience tracks as well. And, as we move through the series, I'll show you why this matters. I've actually just made a few of the tracks on this timeline a little bit bigger just by kind of clicking and dragging them out and making them a little bit wider. And if you look now next to the track names, so audio 1, audio 2, etc., you'll see that there's a little number here that kind of indicates whether it's a mono or a stereo track. So audio 1 here, you can see 1.0, that's a mono track. And then audio 9, you can see a 2.0, that's actually our music, that's a stereo track. If you actually right-click on a track, you can see you have a whole lot of different options here. You can actually change the track type, so between mono and stereo, and a variety of other options. And then you can also add extra tracks as well. So you can right-click and check things and change something if something's been set up wrong. But here's the real thing that I've actually seen happen. A student sets up a dialogue track as stereo, then they wonder why the panning control isn't behaving the way that they expect, or why audio is only coming out of one side perhaps. They spend 20 minutes troubleshooting something, and that comes down to a track type mismatch. And getting this right from the start saves you that headache. So if you have a dialogue track, like I know audio 1 is at the top here, I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to change track type 2, and you can actually see that it's a mono track, so it's been set up correctly. But if it's been set up as a stereo track, you should change that to a mono track because, yeah, dialogue is mono. And now I want to talk about one more concept before we kind of close out this little demo in the software. And this is one that confuses beginners the most, and I just want to make it simple. So every track in your timeline is an individual stream of audio. Dialogue is on its own track, music on its own track, sound effects on their own tracks, each one separate, ambience also on its own track. But at some point, all of those separate streams have to combine into a single output, right? Because when you export your mix, you're exporting one file, not maybe 15 different files. And the thing those tracks all flow into is called the bus. And that's specifically the main output bus. So if you look down at the bottom here, you'll see bus 1, or if I kind of open the mixer up a little bit here, you'll see bus 1 at the end on the mixer 2. That's the last strip and it's labeled bus 1. That's your main output bus. And every track in your session is feeding into that one strip. And that fader on that strip controls the overall output level of the entire mix. And, those output meters, they're measuring what's coming out of that main bus, essentially. At a beginner level, you mostly leave that main fader bus right where it is. You leave it at 0 at Unity. Essentially, 0 or Unity in audio means that the signal is passing through unaffected. So you're not adding anything, you're not subtracting anything, you're just letting it go through. And, what you're shaping with your individual track faders is a balance between everything feeding into that bus. Okay. And the mental model here is really simple. Individual tracks flow into a main output, and your job is to balance the tracks so the output sounds right. And that's the whole concept. Everything else in mixing is just a more detailed version of that. So the last thing I want to say here, and I actually want to be quite clear about this because it comes up quite a lot. For this entire series, I'm going to be using essentially the features available to you in the free version of Resolve. Yes, I'll have the studio version open, but I won't be using any of the studio features. In the free version, Fairlight gives you a fully functional multi-track timeline, a built-in 4-band parametric EQ on every single channel, a built-in dynamics processor with a compressor, a limiter, a gate, and an expander, basic effects including reverb and some noise reduction, full automation on every track, and the complete mixer and metering setup that we just walked through. For where you are right now, that is essentially everything that you need. I'm not going to ask you to spend money to follow along with this series. You're going to use the free version. What the studio version essentially adds is better noise reduction, more advanced kind of voice processing tools, higher track counts, and some collaboration features. Those things have value, but they are not where you are yet, and they're not what this series is actually teaching. So here's where we are. Fairlight is a DAW, a professional audio tool built directly into Resolve. It has 4 main sections: the timeline where you edit, the mixer where you shape your sound, the meters where you check your output, and the index where you manage your tracks. Your tracks are either mono or stereo, and that distinction really matters. Everything feeds into a main output bus, and your meters are measuring that output. That's essentially your mental map of this page. In this next video, we're going to talk about gain staging. I know that doesn't sound exciting, but it's genuinely one of, if not the most important step that beginners actually skip. And skipping it makes everything else harder. You do the gain staging correctly, and the EQ and the compression and the mixing all go smoothly. If this series is useful, and if audio post has always been the part of post-production you never quite figured out, subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.